The autumn rain drummed against the tall windows of Rosewood Manor as Alexander and Catherine sat in the grand library, their hands clasped tightly together on the mahogany desk. The letter that had arrived that morning lay between them, its cream-colored paper seeming to glow in the dim lamplight. Neither had spoken for nearly an hour. Catherine's emerald eyes were red-rimmed, though she had not allowed herself to cry. Not yet. As the Duchess of Rosewood, she had learned long ago that tears were a luxury she could rarely afford. Beside her, Alexander's usually composed features were etched with a pain so deep it seemed to age him years in a single day. 23 years, Alexander finally whispered, his voice barely audible above the storm outside. 23 years we've lived with this hole in our hearts. Catherine squeezed his hand tighter. The gold band on her finger caught the light, reminding her of their wedding day when they had promised to face everything together. They had been so young then, so full of hope and dreams. They had never imagined that life would test them in such a cruel way. The letter was from a private investigator they had hired 6 months ago. After years of dead ends and false hopes, they had almost given up. The official story had always been the same. Their infant daughter had died in the hospital fire 23 years ago. The tiny body they had buried had been identified by the hospital staff. They had mourned, they had grieved, and they had tried to move forward, but Catherine had never stopped feeling that something was wrong. Call it a mother's intuition, but she had always sensed that somewhere out there, their little girl was alive. Alexander had thought it was just grief, the inability to accept such a devastating loss. But when Catherine found inconsistencies in the hospital records last year, he had finally agreed to hire the investigator. "The DNA results are conclusive," Catherine said, reading from the letter for the 100th time. "The body we buried, it wasn't our Elizabeth." Alexander closed his eyes, and Catherine could see him fighting back the tears that threatened to overwhelm them both. They had named their daughter Elizabeth Rose, after Catherine's grandmother. For 23 years, they had visited her grave every month, leaving fresh roses and telling her about their lives, about the siblings she would never meet. "If she's alive," Alexander said slowly, "where has she been all these years? Who raised her? Does she know about us?" These were the questions that had been tormenting them both since the letter arrived. According to the investigator, there was strong evidence that several babies had been secretly removed from the hospital before the fire, sold to families who couldn't have children of their own. It was a scandal that had been covered up for decades. Catherine stood and walked to the window, watching the rain create rivers down the glass. "David and Michael have a right to know," she said, referring to their twin sons who had been born 2 years after Elizabeth's supposed death. "They've grown up believing they had a sister who died." The twins were now 21, attending university abroad. They had always been curious about the sister they had never known, often asking questions that Catherine and Alexander struggled to answer. How do you explain to children that their sister is both everywhere and nowhere, present in every family photo as an empty space, mentioned in every prayer, yet never there to argue with or play with? Alexander joined Catherine at the window, placing his hands on her shoulders. She leaned back against him, drawing strength from his presence. They had weathered many storms together, the pressure of their public duties, the endless scrutiny of the press, the challenges of raising children in the public eye. But this was different. This was about a piece of their hearts that had been stolen from them before they even knew it was gone. "The investigator wants to meet with us tomorrow," Alexander said. "He says he may have found her." Catherine's breath caught in her throat. After all these years of wondering, they might finally have answers. But with those answers would come new questions, new pain, and perhaps the most difficult conversation of their lives. "What if she doesn't want to know us?" Catherine voiced the fear that had been keeping her awake at night. "What if she's happy with the life she has? What if we're just strangers to her? Then we'll respect her wishes, Alexander replied, though Catherine could hear the pain in his voice. But she deserves to know the truth. She deserves to know that we never stopped looking for her, that we never stopped loving her. They stood together in silence, watching the storm rage outside. Tomorrow, they would drive to the investigator's office in the city. Tomorrow, they might learn the identity of the daughter they had thought they had lost. Tomorrow, their world might change forever. But tonight, they held each other close and tried to prepare their hearts for whatever truth awaited them. The rain continued to fall, washing away the old leaves and making way for something new to grow. In the distance, a church bell chimed midnight, marking the end of one day and the beginning of another. Catherine thought about the nursery they had never dismantled, kept exactly as it had been 23 years ago, with pale yellow walls and teddy bears still waiting on the shelf. She thought about the birthday cakes they had never celebrated, the Christmas presents they had never given, the bedtime stories they had never read. And somewhere out there, perhaps their daughter was thinking about parents she had never known, wondering why she had always felt like something was missing from her life. Perhaps she was looking out at the same storm, feeling the same mixture of hope and fear that was keeping Alexander and Catherine awake on this life-changing night. The drive to the city felt endless, though it took only 2 hours. Alexander gripped the steering wheel of their black sedan, while Catherine stared out the passenger window, watching the countryside blur past. Neither had slept the night before, and the weight of anticipation sat heavy between them like an uninvited passenger. James Morrison's office was located in a modest building downtown, far from the grand government offices and luxury hotels they were accustomed to visiting. The private investigator had specifically chosen this location for its discretion. As they climbed the narrow stairs to the 3rd floor, Catherine's heart hammered against her ribs. Morrison was a man in his 50s with kind eyes and gentle hands that had clearly seen decades of delivering both hope and heartbreak to desperate families. His office was small but tidy, with filing cabinets lining the walls and a desk covered in neat stacks of papers. "Your Grace, Your Highness," he said, rising to greet them. Despite their request for informality, old habits died hard. "Please, sit down." Catherine and Alexander settled into the worn leather chairs across from his desk. Morrison poured them tea from a simple ceramic pot, a gesture that somehow made the moment feel more real, more human. "I know this is difficult," Morrison began, pulling a thick folder from his desk drawer. "What I'm about to tell you will be hard to hear, but I believe you have the right to know everything." He opened the folder and spread several documents across the desk. Catherine could see photographs, official forms, and what appeared to be medical records. Her hands trembled as she reached for Alexander's. "The hospital fire was not an accident," Morrison said quietly. "It was deliberately set to cover up an illegal adoption ring that had been operating for several years. Your daughter was one of 7 babies who were secretly removed from the maternity ward in the months leading up to the fire." Alexander's face went pale. 7 babies? The ring was run by Dr. Margaret Thornfield, the head of the maternity ward, and her brother, a lawyer named Richard Thornfield. They targeted families who had money, claiming the babies had various medical complications. They would switch the babies with others who had actually died, provide false death certificates, and then sell the healthy babies to wealthy families who couldn't conceive. Catherine felt sick. "All those months I carried her, all the hope and joy, and they just took her?" "The adoptive families had no idea," Morrison continued gently. "They were told these were legitimate adoptions, that the birth parents had chosen them specifically. Most of them have loved and raised these children as their own for over 2 decades. He pulled out a photograph and placed it carefully in front of them. This is Emma Catherine Sullivan. She was adopted at 3 days old by Margaret and Robert Sullivan, a banker and his wife from Edinburgh. They were told her birth mother was a young woman who had died in childbirth. Catherine gasped and grabbed the photo. The young woman in the picture had Catherine's distinctive green eyes and Alexander's strong jawline. Her dark hair fell in waves around her shoulders, and she was smiling at the camera with a warmth that was unmistakably familiar. "She's beautiful," Catherine whispered, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. "She looks so much like Alexander's sister did at that age." "Emma is 23 years old," Morrison continued. "She graduated from university last year with a degree in art history. She works at a small gallery in Edinburgh and volunteers at a children's hospital on weekends. By all accounts, she's a remarkable young woman." Alexander studied the photograph with intense concentration. "Does she know?" "No." The Sullivans have never told her she was adopted. They believe she is their biological daughter. Margaret Sullivan struggled with infertility for years before they adopted Emma, and Robert Sullivan's medical records were altered to suggest he had a brief affair, explaining any physical differences. The room fell silent except for the sound of Catherine's quiet sobs. 23 years of birthdays, graduations, first days of school, teenage heartbreaks, all the moments they had missed, all the memories that belonged to another family. "The Sullivans are good people," Morrison said gently. "They've given Emma a loving home, a good education, every opportunity. She's never wanted for anything, except her real parents," Alexander said, his voice tight with emotion. Morrison nodded. "There's more. Emma has been having health issues lately, nothing serious, but enough to require some family medical history. She's been asking questions about relatives she's never met, genetic conditions that don't seem to run in the Sullivan family. I believe she's starting to suspect something isn't right." Catherine looked up from the photograph. "What do we do now? How do we approach this without destroying her world?" "That's entirely up to you," Morrison replied. "I can facilitate a meeting if you choose. I can also provide you with more information about her life, her interests, her personality. But I want you to understand the magnitude of what this could mean for everyone involved." He pulled out another document. "The Sullivans are in their 70s now. Robert has been battling cancer for the past year. Margaret has dedicated her entire life to raising Emma. This revelation could devastate them, especially at this stage in their lives." Alexander stood and walked to the window, staring down at the busy street below. "But Emma deserves to know the truth. She deserves to know that she was wanted, that she was loved, from the moment we knew she existed. She also deserves to make her own choice about whether she wants to know you," Morrison said. "I recommend starting slowly, perhaps a letter, explaining who you are and why you're reaching out. Give her time to process the information before any face-to-face meeting." Catherine wiped her eyes and looked at the photograph again. "Where is she now?" "She lives in a small flat above the gallery where she works. She's single, though she's been seeing someone casually for a few months. She has a cat named Rosie and a small garden where she grows herbs." Morrison smiled slightly. "She has your love of gardening, Your Grace." The detail hit Catherine like a physical blow. She had always wondered what traits their daughter might have inherited, what interests they might have shared. To learn that Emma shared her passion for gardening felt like a gift and a torment at the same time. "What about the other families?" Alexander asked, returning to his chair. "The other 6 babies? I'm working on those cases as well, but yours was the one where the evidence was strongest. Some of the other families may never know the truth. Some of the children may never be found." Morrison's expression was somber. "This kind of investigation is like trying to solve a puzzle where most of the pieces have been deliberately scattered and hidden." Catherine folded the photograph carefully and held it against her heart. "When can we write to her?" "Whenever you're ready. but I suggest you take some time to think about what you want to say. This letter will change her life forever. It will change all of your lives forever." As they prepared to leave, Morrison handed them a sealed envelope. "This contains Emma's address and some additional information about her daily routine, in case you decide you want to see her before making contact. But please," he added seriously, "don't approach her directly without warning. The shock could be traumatic." Outside the office, Catherine and Alexander sat in their car in silence for several minutes. The photograph of Emma lay on Catherine's lap, and she traced her daughter's face with a gentle finger. "She has your smile," Alexander said softly. "And your stubborn chin," Catherine replied, managing a small laugh through her tears. They drove home slowly, each lost in their own thoughts about the letter they would need to write, the words they would need to find to explain 23 years of love and loss to a daughter who didn't even know they existed. 3 weeks had passed since they sent the letter. 3 weeks of sleepless nights, untouched meals, and countless conversations about what they would say if Emma chose to respond. Alexander had aged visibly during this time, his dark hair showing new streaks of silver, while Catherine found herself unable to concentrate on even the simplest daily tasks. The letter had been the most difficult thing either of them had ever written. How do you explain to someone that their entire life has been built on a lie? How do you tell someone that you are their parents when they already have parents who love them? They had written dozens of drafts, each one feeling inadequate for such an enormous revelation. In the end, they had kept it simple: the truth about the hospital fire, the illegal adoption ring, and their 23 years of searching. They had included copies of the DNA evidence and Morrison's investigation report. Most importantly, they had emphasized that they wanted nothing from Emma except the chance for her to know the truth about her origins. "She might not respond at all," Alexander had warned Catherine repeatedly. "She might choose to pretend she never received the letter." But Catherine's mother's intuition told her otherwise. Somehow she knew that Emma would respond. She just didn't know how. The answer came on a rainy Thursday morning in November. Catherine was in the conservatory, tending to her orchids, when Mrs. Henderson, their housekeeper, appeared in the doorway with an expression Catherine had never seen before. "Your Grace," Mrs. Henderson said quietly, "there's a young lady at the front door. She says her name is Emma Sullivan, and she's here to see you and His Grace about a letter." Catherine dropped her watering can, sending water and soil scattering across the floor. For a moment, she couldn't breathe, couldn't move, couldn't think. Then her legs were carrying her toward the front of the house, her heart pounding so hard she was sure everyone in the manor could hear it. Alexander was already in the grand foyer, standing frozen near the massive oak door. Through the frosted glass panels, they could see the silhouette of a young woman. She appeared to be pacing slightly, as nervous as they were. "What do we do?" Catherine whispered, suddenly terrified. All these years of waiting, and now she was here, just on the other side of the door. "We open it," Alexander said simply, though his hand shook as he reached for the brass handle. The door swung open slowly, and there she was. Emma Sullivan stood on their doorstep, clutching a worn leather purse and the letter they had sent. She was smaller than Catherine had expected from the photograph, more delicate, but her green eyes were exactly the same, Catherine's eyes, staring back at her from a face that was heartbreakingly familiar, yet completely unknown. "Hello," Emma said, her voice barely above a whisper. I got your letter." For a long moment, no one moved. 3 people who shared blood but were perfect strangers, staring at each other across a threshold that represented 23 years of separation. "Please," Catherine finally managed, stepping back to gesture Emma inside. "Please come in." Emma hesitated, then stepped into the foyer. She looked around at the grand staircase, the crystal chandelier, the oil paintings that had hung on these walls for generations. This is really your home? It is, Alexander said gently. Would you like some tea or coffee? You must be cold. It's quite a drive from Edinburgh. Emma nodded, still clutching her purse. Tea would be nice. They moved to the smaller sitting room, the one Catherine preferred for intimate conversations rather than formal meetings. Mrs. Henderson appeared with a tea service, her eyes kind but discreet as she served them, and then quietly withdrew. Emma sat on the edge of the sofa, her back straight and her hands folded in her lap. Catherine could see so much of Alexander in her posture, in the way she held her head. But when Emma looked up at them, Catherine saw her own uncertainty, her own careful way of observing before speaking. I've read your letter 100 times, Emma said finally. I've read all the documents you included. I even hired my own investigator to verify everything. She paused, taking a shaky breath. It's all true, isn't it? Yes, Catherine said, her voice breaking slightly. I'm so sorry, Emma. I'm so sorry for all of this. Emma's composure cracked then, and tears began to flow down her cheeks. I always felt like something was missing. My whole life I've felt like there was this piece of me that I couldn't find. Mum and Dad, the Sullivans, they love me so much, and I love them, but I always knew I was different somehow. Alexander leaned forward slightly. How are they? The Sullivans? This must be incredibly difficult for them, too. Emma wiped her eyes with a tissue Catherine had quietly offered. Dad died last month. The cancer finally won. Her voice was steady, but filled with grief. Mum told me the truth right before he passed. She said she couldn't let him die carrying this secret anymore. Catherine felt her heart break for this young woman who had lost one father and discovered two parents she had never known. All within a matter of weeks. I'm so sorry for your loss. He was a good man, Emma said fiercely. He was my dad in every way that mattered. He taught me to ride a bike, helped me with homework, walked me down the aisle at my friend's wedding when her father couldn't be there. She looked directly at Alexander and Catherine. I want you to know that. Whatever happens between us, Robert Sullivan was my father. Of course he was, Alexander said immediately. We would never want to diminish what he meant to you or what the Sullivans have given you. They loved you when we couldn't. They gave you the life we were never able to give you. Emma studied them both for a long moment. Mum is devastated. She thinks you're going to hate her for keeping me from you all these years. Catherine shook her head. We could never hate her. She saved you. She loved you when someone else had stolen that chance from us. We're grateful to her. Would you? Emma hesitated, then continued in a rush. Would you like to meet her? She's actually in the car outside. She drove me here because I was too nervous to come alone. Catherine and Alexander exchanged a glance. They had imagined many scenarios for this meeting, but they had never considered that Emma might bring her adoptive mother. Of course, Catherine said. Please ask her to come in. Emma slipped outside and returned moments later with a woman in her 70s. Margaret Sullivan was small and gray-haired, with kind eyes that were red from crying. She looked terrified as she entered the room. Mrs. Sullivan, Alexander stood and extended his hand. Thank you for raising our daughter with such love. Margaret broke down then, sobbing as Catherine embraced her. I'm so sorry, Margaret cried. We didn't know. If we had known she was stolen from you. You gave her a beautiful life, Catherine said firmly. You gave her everything we couldn't. There's nothing to forgive. The four of them sat together for the next several hours, sharing stories and photographs. Margaret showed them pictures of Emma's childhood, first steps, school plays, birthday parties. Catherine and Alexander shared stories about the sons Emma had never met, about the family traditions she might want to be part of if she chose. As the afternoon turned to evening, Emma finally asked the question Catherine had been both hoping for and dreading. What happens now? Where do we go from here? Wherever you want to go, Alexander said. We don't want to disrupt your life or pressure you into anything. We just wanted you to know that you were wanted, that you were loved, and that we never stopped looking for you. Emma was quiet for a long time, staring into her teacup. I'd like to get to know you, she said finally. Slowly. I'd like to meet my brothers, and I'd like to understand where I come from. But I also need you to understand that the Sullivans will always be my family, too. Of course, Catherine said, tears of relief flowing freely now. We wouldn't want it any other way. As Emma and Margaret prepared to leave, promising to return the following weekend, Emma turned back at the door. Can I ask you something? Anything, Catherine said. What did you name me? Before I became Emma. Catherine's voice was barely a whisper. Elizabeth Rose. After my grandmother. Emma smiled for the first time since she had arrived. Elizabeth Rose Sullivan Rosewood. I like the sound of that. After they left, Catherine and Alexander stood together in the doorway, watching the taillights disappear down the long driveway. The storm that had been raging in their hearts for 23 years had finally passed, leaving behind something they had almost forgotten how to feel: hope. She's perfect, Catherine said, leaning against Alexander's shoulder. She's exactly who she was meant to be, Alexander agreed. And now she's home. Inside the manor, Mrs. Henderson was already preparing the guest room that had waited empty for so many years, finally ready to welcome the daughter who had found her way home at last. The long-hidden truth had finally been revealed, and with it came the promise of healing for all the hearts that had been broken by one terrible lie so many years ago.